Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Lobet, denn, Herren, denn, sehr, freundlich, which translates to praise thy Creator, for he owns and loves thee. This is a fairly straightforward chorale, a couple of unique quirks here and there, but all in all, most of the harmony functions the way we would expect, so we're just going to hop right into the analysis. We have one flat in the key signature, and we start on G minor, but we end on D major, and if you're thinking ahead of the rate that I'm talking, you might think that we're ending in a half cadence, but we actually end in the key of D minor, which brings into question the overall tonality of this chorale. I think it's either G minor or D minor. We definitely spend a lot more time in G minor than we do in D minor, but the fact that it comes to a close in the key of D minor is definitely worth taking into consideration. All in all, I don't think it's super important. It's just interesting when we have a chorale when there's some overall tonal ambiguity, but we definitely start in the key of G minor with our one chord. We have some passing tones going on in the lower three voices, and kind of get an idea of like a passing 2 chord here, but we don't get it in its entirety, so the chord's just being referenced here, in my opinion. You could analyze this as a 2/7 chord though. That then takes us to G minor over B flat, G, B flat, and D. We don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral here, it's still a 1 chord, just in first inversion. More passing tones, again sort of implying an incomplete chord. We have A, C in that same D, which is kind of like a passing 5/7 chord, but again without the third. I tend not to analyze the chord unless I'm really compelled to do so when it's subdivided. Incomplete chords are always analyzed when they're on the harmonic rhythm, but with this rapid movement going on here, it's just worth talking about. It's not going to make it onto the page. And that takes us to G minor again, G, B flat, D, and back up to the G that we started on. That takes us to E flat, B flat, D, and G, which is E flat major 7, which is 6/7. Little passing tones here. B flat's a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. G is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. And then we are getting close to our half cadence here, which is always a bit of a toss-up because in cadential situations that have a lot of counterpoint, in Phrygian half cadences is what I meant to say, we usually get like a plethora of different chords we could analyze. There's elements of 6, there's elements of 2, and there are elements of 4, which are all chords that are a third apart from one another, and they're all very common predominant chords. So generally speaking, this is some type of 4/6 chord or some type of 2/4/3 chord. It's really up to you. E flat, C, C, A, and G. That would be A minor 7 flat 5 over E flat, which would be the 2/4/3 route, but if you look at this A as an accented non-chord tone, which I do, this would be E flat, C, G, and G, which would be C minor over E flat. They're basically the same chord, the difference is A versus the doubled G. All in all, not a big deal. They're both predominant chords. Typically 4/6 is more common in the texture, and 2/4/3 and 4/6 are effectively the same chord, so it doesn't make a tremendous difference. Either way, they both resolve to 5, D, F sharp, D, and A, which is our 5 chord, D major in root position. Moving to the key of D minor in the next phrase, we have a perfect authentic cadence where we go directly from it's not a direct modulation, I should be careful when saying that, but we pretty much spend the whole phrase in the key of D minor. We have D, D, F sharp, and A, which is still our 5 chord, D major, so we don't need to analyze, and then we get G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, which is our tonic chord in G minor, and it is our 4 chord in the key of D minor. We also have some passing tones here in the tenor and the melody before we get F, F, A, and D, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. Passing tone in the bass, A, E, A, and C sharp. It's our 5 chord, A major. D is a neighbor tone, E is a chord tone, so we have to mark it. F sharp is a non-chord tone. G is our chordal seventh part of just this like little tenor flourish going on here, and then we cadence not on D minor, but D major. And we know that when we visit the key of the minor dominant in the chorales, it's not uncommon for Bach to have this Picardy third in the cadence where we transition to the key of G minor. But I think this is one of the quirks of the chorale, because we really don't visit G minor for very long. In fact, I'm not even going to say that we visit G minor in anything but these two chords. D major going to G minor definitely feels like a 5-1 in the key of G minor, but because it would only be the key of G minor for 2 beats, I feel like really this is just a greater part of the mostly B flat leading to E flat at the end of this cadence. Definitely this phrase has some of the most unique harmony in this chorale. So we end in an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of E flat, but we pretty much go directly into the key of B flat here, the way that I see it. So we have D major here, and that takes us to G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, which is our 4 chord. However, in the key of B flat, it is our 6 chord. And if you wanted to be particularly granular, you could say that this little section here was 5 going to 1 in the key of G minor as well, and then it would take us to B flat on the exact, the next beat, which you might be able to hear it that way. It actually kind of does sound that way, but I think really in the grand scheme of things, G minor is really more so a byproduct of this leading into B flat. It is a kind of a curious phrase in that regard. When you hear it, we pretty much get B flat right off the bat, and I think the thing that contributes to that is F natural going to G rather than F sharp going to G here. Kind of takes away that dominant role of the leading tone, because it's not a leading tone, it's a subtonic 7th in G minor terms here, but in the key of B flat, that is our dominant going to the submediant here. But regardless, 6 is going to take us to E flat, F natural, B flat, and B flat, but I think this E flat's an accented non-chord tone, and this is actually B flat over D. So the fact that we do get this little G minor tonicization here that leads directly back into the key of B, or it doesn't lead back to the key of B flat, it leads directly into an introduction of B flat for the first time in this chorale. I don't know, it's mostly just semantics. I think all in all, G minor definitely gets tonicized here, but whether or not we modulate to G minor is kind of up in the air because of how quickly B flat is on the coattails of that. So different interpretations of what could go on here. I think, like I said, it's mostly important that you hear it than it is getting it on the page. But after 1-6, we get E flat, G, B flat, and C, which is C minor 7 over E flat, 2-6-5. C's a chord tone. F, F, A, and C, that's our 5 chord. F major, F is a chord tone. Then we have B flat, F, B flat, and D, which is our tonic, B flat major, passing tone in the bass. Then we have D, F, B flat, and D, which is actually a curious chord because this A flat here, that's like a delayed passing tone in the alto over this B flat here, really makes me feel like this is not just our tonic triad in the key of B flat, but in the key of E flat, it's also 5-6, which turns into root position on this beat here, because the A flat would be the lowered 7th scale degree of the B flat major scale, implying that it wants to resolve down to G. So this is our tonic sort of operating as 5 of 4 here, but really we come to this cadence here, and actually I'm just realizing now that I'm looking at the cadence that this should be a Phrygian half cadence, just to be in line with how I've analyzed the cadences in my past analyses. But this is a particular type of cadence that I used to talk about a lot more, just because coincidentally it was more prevalent in the earlier BWV numbered chorales. But this is a type of cadence called a subdominant cadence, or what I've been calling a subdominant cadence. I'm not sure if it's conventional vocabulary, it just seems fitting. The fact that the phrase has a turnaround to tonicize the subdominant right at the cadence. So we stay in the key of B flat. It almost doesn't even feel like we're in the key of E flat, literally right until we hear the precadential chord. And I've been calling it a subdominant cadence because I really think you could analyze this as like 1 going to 4 or 5 of 4 going to 4, because it doesn't even really feel like we've left the key of B flat, like I said, until the very end. But because the subdominant cadence doesn't really exist as conventional vocabulary, I'll just rule it out as a kind of like a very brief and explosive imperfect authentic cadence that feels as if we're tonicizing the subdominant. But regardless, we go to E flat, F, G, and B flat. Sorry, I believe that should be an E flat there now that I'm seeing it. This should be an E flat. Apologies for that not making it there. It should be an E flat right there. It's our tonic triad regardless. Okay, moving to the next phrase, we end with a perfect authentic, a half cadence in the key of G minor again, but we're going to go to the key of G minor via F major, which is kind of an interesting key relationship when compared with E flat, because the keys are far away from one another, or more distant than our typical key relationships, which are usually adjacent to one another on the circle of fifths. So we start off with a B flat chord, which in the key of E flat major is 5, but in the key of F major it is 4. B flat, F, B flat, and D, and that's just going to take us to F for an extended period of time. We have F, A, and C. It's our tonic. G's a non-chord tone, B flat's a non-chord tone, G's a non-chord tone, and C, sort of implying kind of like a 5-7 chord in passing, but again, similar to the chords we saw at the beginning of the chorale, they're not entirely intact, and when subdivided like that, I don't really mark them. I could just mention the fact that they're kind of being referenced there. But regardless, we get A, F, and C, very similar to the beginning of our chorale here. But when we look at this chord here, we have B flat, G, E, and C, which is an entirely intact chord, and that is C7 over B flat, which is 5-4-2, and coincidentally that does take us to where we would expect it to resolve, which is 1-6, A, F, and that same C, 1-6. So we're seeing the tonic chord resolve, even though it's a subdivided chord progression, we're seeing the harmony resolve in a normative fashion, which is exciting because 4-2 chords typically resolve that way. And it's interesting to see them continue to resolve the way in a number of different contexts, whether they're subdivided or happening from harmonic rhythm beat to beat. But then afterwards we have a similar situation that we had on the end of the first beat. We have G and B flat and G with C, so it's an incomplete chord, but still kind of like a passing 5 chord that takes us to F major. F, C, A, and A, which is just taking our chord and putting it in root position. And then we have E, C, G, and A. And I think here, actually, what this E natural is being turned into is like a bit of a pivot point that recontextualizes itself as 6 in the key of G minor. So I feel like this F major chord has potential to be our 7 chord in the key of G minor. It's relatively uncommon, but not uncommon enough for me to question it. The fact that our subtonic 7th is a common chord between the two keys, because we see 7 not necessarily lead directly to 1. Sometimes we do, but we see it sometimes, maybe even more commonly, connect to 5 as a predominant chord, because it is just a stable major chord in the key, in the minor key, that is. And here we do see it go to 5, F sharp, C, A, and D. In this case it is 5-6-5. The inversion I don't think matters too much, but that takes us to D, B flat, F sharp, and D. A bit of an incidental augmented triad though, but I think that's more so a byproduct of the counterpoint than anything else. 5-6-5 takes us to E natural, B flat, G, and C, which is 4-6-5. It's not super uncommon to see 5 in first inversion to go to 4. Root position would be a lot more interesting, but it's a bit of a turnaround that's going to lead us towards the tonic, because the tonic's not quite there yet in terms of the harmony. But we then have F sharp, A. There's also a non-chord tone, A and C, which is a root position F sharp diminished chord, 4 going to 7, one of the most common subdivided chord progressions in all of Bach. Definitely makes sense that we see it here. And then we see G, B flat, A, and B flat, this A being a 9/8 suspension over the bass. Very common to see those over tonic triads. Passing tone here, D is a chord tone, G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark either of those. That takes us to 5, D, D, G, and A. G being a 4/3 suspension over the bass, C being a little delayed passing 7th, and that takes us to another sort of Phrygian half-cadential setup. We have E flat, B flat, G, and G. Another 6 chord here, so a deceptive lead-in. And that takes us to this D here, which is like a suspended 7th happening on the offbeat. F sharp, another kind of implying a little bit of dominance in here in the inner voices here, with D and F sharp being the root and the 3rd of the 5 chord in the key of G minor. Then we have E flat, D, G, and G, maybe implying a bit of a 7 chord here, but I look at this 7 as a 7/6 suspension over the chord, which would lead us to C and, oh goodness, G being our chord tones, which would make this C minor over E flat, which is 4/6. Sort of validates or justifies the earlier Phrygian half cadence we saw. And of course, half cadences end with the 5 chord. D, F sharp, D, and A. So a similar structure, not quite as chromatic or contrapuntally dense as what's happening here in the first cadence, but regardless, they have a similar harmonic output or analysis to them. This could be interpreted as 2, but 2 and 4 very similar in terms of both their function and pitch content. So either way, they're both educated analyses, and I think they both fit the ticket. We have another half cadence in the key of G minor in the next phrase. This one's considerably shorter. We have G, G, D, and B flat. So that's resolving our 5 chord here with our tonic G minor. Passing tone in the bass. We get some chromaticism kind of interestingly here in the alto. We have A, we have C, F natural, and A, which is F major over A. That's 7/6. This little passing F sharp here does interject a bit of an F sharp diminished chord over A, which is 7/6. It's just chromatic passing chord. Whether you look at the F as a chromatic tone or the F sharp as a chromatic tone, I don't think it really matters. I think both chords sort of play a role on the beat. And that takes us to G minor in first inversion. B flat, D, G, and G. 1/6. 1/7/6, 1/6. Very common chord progression here. It's pretty cool. We see both 7s because the thing that's changed between them is the root being sharp or natural, which is usually not the case. In most cases, it's either E versus F sharp, but here we have the chromaticism which separates the two, which is definitely a unique take on this progression, because if you've watched my videos in the past, statistically you've run into me explaining this chord progression, why it's significant in Bach, and the fact that it pops up all the time. But after 1/6 we have C, which is a non-chord tone, another C, E flat, which is a non-chord tone, and G, which is like a passing 4 chord, a little bit, C minor in root position, and that takes us to D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord, D major, passing 7th in the bass, takes us to B flat, G, D, and G, 1/6, G minor in first inversion, neighbor tone in the bass. D is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. C is a little neighbor tone here. And that takes us to G minor in first inversion again, so we don't need to mark it. And that takes us to our 5 chord here. D, G is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, so F sharp is the 3rd of the chord. Then we have D and A, D major, root position. Next phrase is another kind of interesting one, kind of a kindred spirit to the third phrase of the chorale, and coincidentally we have another sort of G minor / B flat ambiguity going on here. However, I think it's a little bit more developed in this one here because the B flat has potential to have a larger presence, but on the flip side of the coin, I think that we're just going to keep this whole phrase from an analytical perspective in the key of G minor, and it just so happens that we have a little developed section here that emphasizes B flat for a little bit. So we're seeing sort of the flip side of the argument that I made earlier on. So we start the phrase off with D major, D, A, F sharp, and D, so we don't need to reanalyze, and that takes us to G minor, G, G, D, and B flat. Root position, passing seventh in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, E flat, B flat, G, and B flat. E flat is our sixth chord. Little passing tone in the tenor again. This is E flat major. That takes us to D, D, F, and B flat. So some transitive harmony here where we're going against the grain. Typically normative harmony, or I guess the way that harmony is often observed is in tonality, is that the cycle of falling fifths, especially in Baroque music, is sort of the path of least resistance, or the number one priority in terms of where chords will resolve, right? Because the roots are a fifth apart, and when the roots are a fifth apart, going down, they sort of follow the natural contour of the major scale where we start, or I guess just a diatonic scale in general, where we start on the tonic and we end on the tonic, and it produces a chord progression where the roots are a fifth apart or a fourth apart, and when the roots are a fourth or fifth apart, they have one tone in common they have one tone in common and two tones that are not in common, which is sort of like the Goldilocks ratio of familiarity, and it creates the chord progression where a lot of the movements that we have harmonically are derived from. But yeah, so this is going against the grain. Typically 3 goes to 6. Here we see 6 going to 3, but it makes sense because you can use the same voice leading to go in either direction, right? If 3 can go to 6, why not transitively can it go to 3? That's my logic, and that's what I've been calling it, but I can't really find any writing about it anywhere that describes it in that way, so that's just terminology that I use. But we have a passing tone in the bass here, and we have a little neighbor tone here. E flat and C are both non-chord tones. It takes us to B flat in root position. Here, B flat, D, F, and D. So we could just change the figured bass, and then B flat is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. It's this G right here, that's the only non-chord tone of the whole beat. And if you really wanted to, you could take this section here, and in the key of B flat, say that this was 4, going to 1-6, going to 1-5-3. Because it does kind of sound like a plagal progression in B flat, but I feel like that's just the nature of introducing the relative major in a minor context. I think that minor can have that exact same effect on major keys as well, especially if it's emphasized over a lengthier period of time. All in all, it's a bit of a toss-up. I think there is an argument to be made that we do briefly visit B flat here, but that's why I sort of offer this secondary analysis in terms of how you could analyze it that way, because I'm still on the fence about it. But regardless, my intuition tells me that we're still in the key of G minor, because we pretty much pivot right back around, making use of E natural and F sharp on the next beat anyways. So we would have modulated by this beat regardless of whether we moved to B flat or not. That takes us to B flat, G, E, and C, which is C7 over B flat. That is not a secondary dominant, that is melodic minor, so this is C7. That would be a 4 chord in third inversion, passing tones in the lower 3 voices. That leaves us with A, F sharp, and C. Again, 7-6 is one of the most common subdivided chord progressions in Bach. 4 going to 7, that's exactly where the 4-2 chord would want to resolve, a fifth down. So 4 going to 7, that's 5 away, and so the chord in first inversion, so the 4-2 chord resolving the way we would expect. And that takes us to our tonic, G minor. G, B flat, G, and B flat, 2 roots and 2 thirds, but not really a big deal. We see Bach spelled like that all the time. Little passing C there before we get B flat, D, G, and B flat, which is briefly taking our chord and putting it in first inversion. Not a huge deal, but something that I take note of. That takes us to C, E flat, G, and A minor 7 flat 5 in first inversion. You know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. D is a non-chord tone, D is a non-chord tone, and F sharp is a non-chord tone. This is a bit of a 5 chord, just a 2-5 subdivided chord progression, and as we're getting into our perfect authentic cadence, we haven't quite reached it yet, so Bach is preparing us for a turnaround. 5 is going to take us to 6, E flat, B flat, G, and G. E flat major in root position, passing 7th in the bass. C is a non-chord tone, D is a passing 7th. That takes us to C, E flat, G, and A. Another 2-6-5 chord, A minor 7 flat 5 over C. A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. D, D, F sharp, carried earlier from the measure. And then A, which is our 5 chord, D major, passing 7th in the tenor. And then we cadence on G minor, G, B flat, D, and G. G minor in root position. So Bach fakes us out with the 6th chord and then uses the exact same progression that he started the measure off with to introduce our cadence. Penultimate measure, again with another Phrygian half cadence. Sorry, Phrygian's kind of hard for me to spell. We're going to move right to it. We start off with G minor, G, B flat, D, and G. No need to reanalyze. Passing tones in the lower voices, B flat, G, D, and D. Just 1-6. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, G, B flat, D, and G. This progression looks familiar. It looks like the first phrase. That's just taking our chord and putting it back in root position. Passing tone, passing 7th in the bass and a passing tone in the tenor as well before we get E flat, G, D, and G. I'm going to say that this D is a 7-6 suspension over the bass. You could call this a 6-7 chord if you were so inclined, but I'm going to say that this is just a big 4-6 chord, C minor over E flat. Move that a little bit closer to the tone in the bass. B flat's a passing 7th, A would be a non-chord tone, and C and G would, C and G. I really should trust my intuition more because I was right with those. C and G, both just respelling the C minor chord, and that takes us to 5. D, F sharp, D, and A. D major, root position. And then we get to an interesting ending phrase. Definitely not where I would expect it to go, but we are going to get a perfect authentic cadence, which is expected, but in the key of D minor, which fakes us out. We only visited D minor very briefly here during the second phrase. It's almost as if the form of this chorale was spending the majority of the time developing what we saw in the middle section of the chorale and then ending with the first two phrases. It's interesting also that we have D minor with no leading tone in the melody. It's B flat, C natural, D, then C sharp, then D. Definitely kind of a modal feel in that regard. I should have mentioned that earlier. But we have very similar beginning and ending, sort of like a ternary form, like an A, B, A sort of thing going on here. But yeah, so we start the phrase off with D major, D, D, F sharp, and A. No need to reanalyze. That takes us to G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, which is our tonic in the key of G minor. It's also our 4 in the key of D. Passing tone in the melody here. Again, interesting that it's B flat to C natural to D. Sorry, this is definitely a B flat because of the key signature. So B flat to C natural to D is just natural minor, but it's definitely unusual to maybe as a melody, not as unusual as it would be in an inner voice, but we see different configurations of minor, just like hot swapping the different tones based on different circumstances. But yeah, I guess it's not the most interesting thing. We then have F, A, and D. It's 1-6. Passing, or just non-chord tones, 3 of them. We have E natural, B flat, G, and D, which is like a 2-6-5 chord happening in passing here, E minor 7 flat 5 over G. We know that Bach loves those in cadential situations. That takes us to 5, A, E, and C sharp, A major, passing tone here with the F sharp going to the G, which is very interesting, sort of reintroducing the idea of G minor right here at the end, but definitely feels like D supersedes any reference to G in the inner voices because the leading tone resolving to D feels a lot more consequential. But afterwards we get A, G, and C sharp, which is like taking our chord and putting it, well, it's still in root position, but adding a chordal 7th in place of the 5th of the chord. So we could just change the figure bass to reflect that, and that takes us to D major, D, A, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. Or maybe we do pivot to the key of G minor right here at the end because of the F sharp, but I feel like this is more just sort of like a counterpoint than anything else. Definitely some interesting pitch choices in this last phrase. But regardless, that's today's chorale. The subdominant cadence was pretty interesting. Distant modulation was also pretty interesting. E flat going to F. The ambiguous sort of overall tonality is another takeaway point. And what else? Mid-phrase modulation, of course, where we have a phrase that starts in a particular key or modulates to a key at the beginning and then ends in a different key. Typically, when Bach modulates, like here, for example, when we start a phrase in a new key than the previous key, he'll stay there until the cadence. But here we have, like, we go from D minor to B flat, or even G minor to B flat, and then we end in E flat. That's an example of what I've been calling a mid-phrase modulation. That happens a couple of times in the chorale here in the first system, namely. But other than that, fairly straightforward harmony. Lots of mostly functional chord progressions happening here. A couple of particular ones that are quirky. But other than that, yeah, especially this chromaticism here, actually, that's, other than that, that's really all I wanted to talk about. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content as well. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.